Yeah, one of the first POCs that I met said that a lot of people that they knew that would move here didn't last here because of the nature of the dominant demographic here.
Welcome to the Desert Lady Diaries podcast, conversations with women who have found their home in the Mojave Desert. I'm Dawn Davis, and this is episode 151. Find out more about the podcast at desertladydiaries.com and engage with the guests, with other listeners, or me on Facebook and Instagram at Desert Lady Diaries.
Blanca S. Villalobos is a freelance cultural worker from the San Gorgonio Pass of California with ancestral roots in Mexico. They are developing their practice on the ancestral lands of the Cahuilla, Yuhaviatam, and Marangayam peoples and hold space for community well-being through their online offerings. Welcome to the podcast.
Hi, good morning.
Nice to have you here.
Yeah.
What was your first experience with any kind of desert?
Well, for myself, I have to describe the migration story
Please.
of my parents. So my family immigrated here in the 70s. Half of them did. I didn't. I was born north of the border, so I automatically became a citizen through the US government. But as a child, I would go with my parents and my younger sister back and forth through Mexico at least a few times a year. And so traveling through the pass area, through the Coachella Valley and into Arizona, and then down through Sonora and Sinaloa, that was my first experience with desert. So I would have to say, being someone, though I'm not an immigrant, I wasn't displaced from my country. My ancestors and my community migrates like a lot of living organisms do. It's part of their nature. So I would have to say my first desert experience was through going back and forth through Mexico, specifically through the Sonora and Colorado desert.
And how did you come to be in the Morongo Valley or the Mojave Desert?
My first experience with the Mojave was through my siblings taking me to Joshua Tree National Park when I was a child. But we would go after hours, so we wouldn't have to pay because that was a barrier, and I think it still is for a lot of people. And so we would go after hours just to stargaze, and that was my first experience with this particular desert that I'm living in now. But I moved here. I've been a resident now in the Morongo Basin for over a year, since late 2019.
And what drew you to move here?
Honestly, the accessibility, I think, luckily that I had to find a home that was financially doable for myself. I was living in Beaumont with family, and nothing that I was looking for was something that I could afford or something that even slightly looked like a home.
Yeah.
So I know that a lot of folks like to live in this area because for various reasons, but it was really hard for me to find affordable housing in the Morongo Basin. And I only ended up in this home through a friend and through a landlord who was pretty, laid back. And I didn't have to do all the
like the credit checks and the big deposit.
I didn't have to do any of that, which even as a person of color is really hard because, there's a lot of racism that happens in like what kind of name I use, how I talk over the phone, what kind of work I do. I'm a cultural worker, so that to a lot of people doesn't mean stability,
Right.
So I would say that I ended up here through luck, and also because of the connections that I had already built over here. I used to work at the local desert preserves as the outdoor educator. And so I knew a little bit about the conservation community, but I didn't know any Black, Indigenous, or POC folks out here before I moved here. That was a whole journey for me, is trying to find my people when I moved here, because it's a very white area and very red area. And so any BIPOC person that I saw in the cafe before COVID, I really wanted to attach myself to.
Well, and I imagine depending on what their experience was, they were probably very grateful for that as well.
Oh, yeah. One of the first POCs that I met said that a lot of people that they knew that would move here didn't last here because of the nature of the dominant demographic here.
I felt that even when I would come here when I came here and started living here, I'd go to places maybe like the Saloon or other places, and coming from living in Los Angeles for almost 7 years and other urban areas, I could feel, and I'm white, I could feel like, wow, this is really white. And my Asian friends would come from LA to visit, And my friend Carrie would say, she'd look around and she'd go, I'm the only Asian person here, right? I go, I know, I can feel it. And she ran events in downtown LA for a long time and would post pictures of some of the events. And it would bring me to tears because I was missing that interaction with all those different people. So I can't even imagine for someone who is a person of color that it's really not very easy here.
Yeah. And then just like, again, like the additional layer of also of being someone that's queer and non-binary, the addition of that, having to figure out in public spaces, how can I show up as my full authentic self in this public space out of safety?
So a lot of people that I've talked to on this podcast have said that when they've come to the desert, they felt like they were accepted here, that kind of anything goes. Was that different for you, being a person of color and that layer, like you said, of queer added on top of it?
Yeah, I mean, I think because of my personality, I feel like I'm a very easygoing person. So, and I don't know how much of that is just my personality or of my being socialized to perceived as safe as possible.
Go along to get along, sort of.
Yeah. So when I moved here, I automatically started. I live in Morongo Valley, and I live pretty far away from my neighbors. So I have to walk around to be able to actually see anybody. And so when I first moved here, it made sense for me to immediately start walking the neighborhood so that my neighbors could understand that this new person of color actually lives here and isn't a threat. And so part of it was like, getting to know my community and form relationships. But it's also like, hey, I'm not an unhoused person. I'm not just crossing anyone's property, because I know through like the small phone groups that I've been added to in my community, that anyone that seems like out of place is immediately met with like a threat, from my neighbors. And that's really horrible. And so it's complicated to answer that question, because I feel like I had, due to the way that I look and can be perceived, I had to, out of my own safety, make myself visible in my neighborhood as a neighbor. But outside of my neighborhood, in the community, I think because I am able to just kind of chat with anybody in public, when we were able to do that, like hang out in public spaces, it felt welcoming for sure. But I mean, I've only been here over a year, and I don't know the whole history of this desert in particular, in the settlement of the area. So I would say that because I'm most often around queer, trans, BIPOC people, those are the people that I hang out with. So I don't usually place myself in spaces where that's not the center of the space due to safety. So in some ways, I do live in a bubble, and I try to like remind myself not to do that, because there are other realities that people are living and that I'm also living. So yeah, I think because I intentionally place myself in certain spaces, I felt welcome. Yeah, so I'll pause there, because I think that's where I want to live. Yeah.
Okay. Well, and what's interesting is my next question, usually when someone describes how they came to be in this desert, was how they found their community, and coming in at a time when we were all locked down, wearing masks. I mean, it was not easy probably to find even those spaces for you, was it?
I moved here in November of 2019. And so I grew up with the internet, like not immediately, but I grew up with like LiveJournal and MySpace and then Facebook and Instagram. So I've actually have met quite a few amazing BIPOC throughout 2020 and even now, because of my access to social media and certain like internet spaces that are created by BIPOC for BIPOC. And so it hasn't been hard for me. Like, I'm a very social person, and I live by myself with just my two animals. And so if I know I'm like really needing that nourishment from community, I'm going to take the possible steps to be able to find people. I was doing that before COVID, and I've been doing that since COVID. And so it hasn't been hard for me. I think a lot of that ease that comes with that is because of my time when I lived in Portland, Oregon, which was a whole other like shock for me.
Good segue. I was going to ask about, because was that before you came here back to like Beaumont in California? What took you up to Portland?
Yes, I moved to Portland, Oregon in December 2020. 2010 for school.
Mhm.
And I was already about 23. So I went there for school and I graduated and I stayed to work and organize and to do my art practice. And then I moved back down February of 2018, back to Beaumont and with my family. Yeah. So I went up there for school and I stayed for work and for organizing and for my art practice. But towards the end of my time there, it was like 7.5 years. I really felt like my cycle there was over, and I missed the landscape here, and I missed my family. My immediate family were 11 people total. We all don't get along. Like we all get along, but it's different levels of relating. So I mostly just wanted to be closer to my parents because they're elders. Yeah, it worked out well that I came back right before a global pandemic.
Yeah, for sure. And you are number 8 of 9, is that right?
Yes.
Number 8 of 9. What's the age range, like the oldest to the youngest?
I think my oldest brother is in his early 50s now.
Wow.
And the youngest is just a year younger than me, and she'll be 33 this summer.
Okay.
So grew up in a I think they call it a multi-status family. So different ranges of like citizenship, right? For documentation. And then also different generations, because my parents had me when they were in their 40s, and so by the time I was born, one of my siblings was already like 12 years old, I want to say, or older. So different generations in my family, which was great and also hard for like relating.
Sure. Well, I think everybody expects, well, you know what, even if you think about the Waltons, are you familiar with the Waltons? It was an old TV program in like the 70s, and I think there were 6 or 8 kids, but they all lived in the same house growing up together. And for the most part, it seemed like they got along, but there were always those little scripts where they didn't. I'll never forget the one at Christmas time. They were decorating the tree and the older sister calls the little one a pissant. And so to say that you're 9 or 11 people and you all don't get along is really honest. I think people like to think that they have a big family and everybody's all chummy, but the reality is there are those different undercurrents in the roles we all play, as kids and siblings in certain ways. So
yeah, it was definitely interesting for me to be on the younger end of my siblings and to just experience how they were relating to my parents, and then how my siblings relate to one another, and then how I would relate to them, because we're all coming from, some of us again crossed the border, then got assimilated, some of us are born here. There's all these nuances that I didn't really understand or see when I was younger, but now reflecting back on it, like I do understand that, and I see why they're now the people that they are, and why I'm the way that I am.
So let's talk about being a cultural worker.
Yeah, so that for me is, I want to say, just a summary of the work that I do. So I used to just identify as an interdisciplinary artist, and I still do, but because I also work now more specifically in conservation, with the focal point of understanding how the roots of conservation and environmentalism in the United States is rooted in white supremacy, and in trying to unlearn that within an organization and also outside of an organization. So most of my work now falls between either collaborating or being contracted by conservationists and people doing environmental work. And on the other side, it's mostly like the arts, like writing and teaching and facilitating spaces. So for the most part, that's a little bit of what I do in terms of my cultural work, is just trying to shift certain norms in culture that don't serve us anymore. And by us, I mean like a collective, which doesn't mean that sometimes, it's like thinking of people with a lot of privilege. Like in order to shift culture, you're going to lose some of that privilege in order for other folks that have experienced inequities their whole life, so that way they can actually be able to access equity. And so, it's interesting where I've landed now, because I don't have a background in sciences, like academically speaking. All that kind of came later, but I grew up understanding certain aspects of nature through my parents and through like traditional indigenous knowledge from Mexico that my parents hold that they don't actually name as indigenous. It's just like what they grew up with, right? And a lot of that has to do the loss of like associating that with indigenous knowledge. It is because of colonization. And so it's just interesting that the work that I do now is really focused on equity and justice, because I grew up with my parents not really being involved in the way that I saw their families being involved with politics in Mexico. And whenever my especially my dad, he's very protective. Whenever he hears that I'm advocating or for actions or assisting and attending protests, he's always really scared because of what he sees when he hears. You know, that's valid. I just think that because him and my mom grew up in a very corrupt Mexico, which it still is, that there's kind of this understanding of, well, we're not going to get involved in politics because it's all corrupt in Mexico, which is very valid. Like I had to understand that as a kid because I would see a lot of my elders over there involved in politics and my parents. But that's just all to say that now through my cultural work, it's really hard for my family, I think, to really have that solidified as like my career or my path, because it feels, I always forget the word, but it feels out of the norm. I'm freelance, I'm self-employed. I don't work for a government agency and I don't also work for NGO. So being an artist, first of all, was already hard for them to accept. And then also being someone that's an organizer through my culture work and activist is also really hard to accept as what I want to do in my life, because I think it's always, and because of capitalism, they always want to make sure that I'm financially stable and taken care of.
Right. And sometimes it's just more because of the way work in general has changed. Their understanding of work is nuts and bolts and hammers and typewriters and those tactile things that you do work with. Whereas our culture seems to be, even though we still need all of those things and vocational education is very important, there's a shift to, I don't know if I want to say intellectual, but it's like less hard labor, more soft labor. But even that's not a fair representation, because I've acted, I've written, and you've acted and you've written, and you know that stuff is work, you know?
Yeah.
And it's exhausting. And people look at it and they go, yeah, you're just playing though. I'm like, well, not really.
Yeah, so I think, yeah, so like I'm really happy where I'm at now, because in this work that I'm doing, I have a lot of autonomy, right? And I get to choose what entities or collectives I want to work with. And I get to ask them certain questions that maybe they've never been asked before, especially like considering like big institutions or government agencies. I can't step into any kind of collaborative work with them if I don't see that they're not doing the work to unlearn any kind of white supremacist foundations in their structures, like internal structures. It's exciting for me because I don't have to put myself in harm's way anymore, because that was something that I experienced a lot at one of my last nonprofit jobs, was having to be one of the few POCs in a space that was experiencing not just racism externally from like visitations or from visitors, but also internally. And so, and then speaking about it and vocalizing that and being met with a lot of defensiveness because of the way that a lot of conservation and environmental foundations were built, was like around these kind of like values that white supremacy is nourished by. So being able to tell an organization, like, I see this huge gap here. I see the way that you're approaching this is not cool. And it's hard, I think, for people that are used to that kind of cultural environment to unlearn that. Again, that's why I'm happy that right now I get to choose who I can work with, and I get to have my own, not just contracts, of my own like boundaries with how I do my labor and how I collaborate with others.
Speaking of that, there's two things that I want to cover with you that you offer. One of them is kind of on the tail end of what we were just talking about, consulting about companies or entities investing in diversity and inclusion. And then the other piece I want to talk about a little bit is your dream work and how that comes into play. So let's talk about your consultation work, because someone may be listening who's looking for that sort of thing. So sell yourself.
Yeah, sure.
Here you go.
Yeah. So I'm just gonna be flat out transparent for anyone that's listening.
Do.
I don't believe in DEI trainings. I don't think they work. I think we're at a point where we've known that they don't work. There was an example of someone that worked with the police officers, I think in somewhere in like Oakland, California, or up north in California, who did these trainings with police officers and then was shot by one of those people in the cohort.
Oh my goodness.
And so I think DEI is helpful in a way to kind of help people conceptualize that this is necessary work. But what I've seen as someone who's like led these trainings and has been a part of these trainings through organizations is that there's no action, there's no tangible actions that happen. It feels like something that caters mostly to white folks, to kind of feel like they are doing the work. But I think what actually needs to happen is a lot of those structures in those organizations actually need to be dismantled, which looks like people leaving their posts, people being fired, which means going beyond just representation. I feel like there needs to be a whole total burning of the structure itself and reckoning with it. And then there's going to be a lot of loss and grief because that happens when things are taken away and are burned, is that there's a lot of loss and grief, but then there's new terrain for things to be built that actually serves more people and is more healthy for others. And so even though I do this work, I'm always really transparent about like, if you want to hire me, if we're going to chat about, diversity, equity, and training, I'm approaching it as a way of, okay, how are you dismantling white supremacy as an individual and then as someone within an organization? What does that look like? What are the actual steps that need to happen? Not just theorizing it anymore, not just talking about it. Read as many books as you think you need, but go beyond the books, go beyond learning
uncomfortable.
About your privilege. Yeah, it's really just like recognizing that you might have to lose something for there to be collective liberation.
And at the end of the day, when one person can start doing that, other people get, I guess, braver or more courageous to also do it. And that's how the change happens.
Like I'm someone that has a lot of privilege still, even with the like marginalized identities that I hold. I still have to lose some things in order for people that have been historically more marched than I am to have opportunities and to feel safe. And so that's how I approach any kind of like DEI or like Jedi, whatever they're calling it now, work is. And I also think that if you're doing those trainings, everybody in your organization, board members, executive director, everyone in that whole hierarchy needs to be involved. It can't just be people at the bottom. It can't just be people, managers. If everyone's involved, then everyone's going to start at the same place, hopefully, if that's how the space is created. And then hopefully people at the very top understand how power dynamics really, how those impact the way that white supremacy works within their systems, right? And so I think that anytime organization wants to do some kind of training like that, everyone needs to be involved. And it needs to happen, often.
Yeah. Well, yeah. And that's a good point. Not just one time and we're good. You have to come back and revisit those things and talk about the experiences that you had in trying to break those norms, if you will. And just for someone who's listening who isn't familiar with that terminology, DEI, it's diversity, equity, inclusion, right?
Yeah, diversity, equity, inclusion. And I think in the Jedi, it's justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion.
Okay. Yeah. So let's talk about dream work.
It's something that I have a lot of fun with. And I also think it's really important. So for folks that don't know what dream work is, so I hold space for dream practice, mostly for Black, Indigenous, and people of color. But I also do have a system where it's also open to folks that are not from that community, as long as I have like a whole like filtering application where I ask people that are not BIPOC to share how they're unlearning settler colonialism outside of the program. So the programs that I teach don't center that work. So I want to make sure that if they're a white person who's hopefully working through how to be an accomplice and ally, that they're doing that work outside of the program, because I want to be able to minimize as much harm from white folks if they're going to be sharing space around really vulnerable topics like dreams, trauma, ancestor work in the programs that I offer. So I wholeheartedly believe that we collectively and individually in all cultures all hold some kind of connection to dreams, having a really important role in community, especially within Indigenous communities. Like a lot of dreams hold like a lot of knowledge around how to take care of the community, medicine, how to maybe approach certain conflicts that are happening. I know the little bit that I've read around the settlers going into Mexico, the Spaniards, a lot of those people in leadership in Mexico were having dreams about folks coming onto the land from far away. And so like there's records showing that a lot of cultures have like looked to their dreams for insight and for clarity and for healing. And I also think they're really potent for those of us that identify as artists, writers and musicians, performance folks. There's so much inspiration that we can get from our dreams that we can then infuse into our waking life for any projects that we're working on. And I offer so much guidance. So the moment that I realized that I was dating a white person that totally saw dreams as nothing and just dismissed them, I knew that like I needed to start investing more time and energy into that part of myself, because I'm a very active dreamer. For someone to say that to me, and that person having been like white person, a man, it just felt like an additional part of like ongoing colonialism of someone being like, hey, your indigenous knowledge, that's what it is, isn't real, and it isn't
worthy.
I know worth anything, and which I know for a fact has actually helped me figure out. I've had dreams about certain jobs that I've interviewed for, where the dream tells me that's not going to be a safe environment for you, or you're not going to be paid sustainably enough, and then I don't get that job, and then I reflect back on it, I'm like, oh yeah, that was actually really good insight. And so there's been multiple dreams that I've had where I believe that a lot of the messages that I get are from my ancestors. There's been a lot of dreams that I've had where my ancestors are really looking out for me and letting me know, sharing with me the clarity around a specific situation that I might not be aware of when I'm awake. But when we're dreaming, we're asleep, right? And it's all these hidden things that happen at night. When we think about like nocturnal creatures, they get to see what we don't see, right? And so when we dream, we're able to tap into that insight that's usually hidden from us when we're awake.
I love that. I'm into it. So let's tell folks how they can find you if they're either interested in consulting with you on diversity, equity, and inclusion, or the dream work. How can they find you?
Yeah. So I have a website. It's just my full name, Blanca S. Villalobos.com. And so people can read it through my bio. They can see all the artwork that I've done in the past and people that I've been working with in the past as well. So my website, definitely. And I also have a Patreon, which is just patreon.com/BS Villalobos as well.
Okay. I will put that all in the blog post that I do with the podcast so they can get that as well. Thanks for coming on. And before I let you go, I want to draw a couple of random questions from the magic jar for Diary Unlocked. If you're listening for the first time and you're not familiar with Diary Unlocked, this is exclusive content for Patreon supporters of the Desert Lady Diaries podcast. You can go out there, sign up to be a patron, and you will have access not only to Blanca's Diary Unlocked, but to all of them probably for the last year and a half or two. The questions I'm going to ask Blanca are... Is this the life you thought you'd have when you were a teenager? Any advice for a previous boss? Who is one person that made an impact on your life and in what way? And name the last 2 desert creatures you saw and where did you see them? So if you want to hear Blanca's answers to those questions, again, go to desertladydiaries.com, click on the support tab and sign up to be a patron of the podcast. Blanca, thanks again for being here today. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you so much, Dawn. This is a lot of fun.
I've got a shout out to Edwina C. this week for signing up for the new episode newsletter. Thanks so much, Edwina. Do you know someone who might like this episode? Take a moment right now to share it with them. Thanks so much for listening.